Every evening, right before the dishes go into the sink, the same small ritual happens in this kitchen. The banana peel from the afternoon snack. The eggshells from this morning's breakfast. The wilted outer leaves of last week's lettuce. The used coffee grounds, still slightly damp, scraped out of the filter. None of it goes in the trash can. All of it goes into a small container by the back door, and once a day, that container gets carried out to the garden and emptied into a bucket. Not a compost bin in the corner of the yard, a bucket buried in the ground, sitting in the middle of the tomato bed, with only the lid showing above the soil line. That is the entire system. No turning with a pitchfork. No hauling finished compost across the yard in a wheelbarrow. No standing over a steaming pile in July, breathing in a smell that makes the neighbors close their windows. Just a $5 bucket, a drill, and 90 days. This video is the complete step-by-step method for building one of these from scratch this weekend. The exact specifications that determine whether it works or fails. And the 4 mistakes that cause most first attempts to either rot, smell, or simply stop working within the first month. Here is why this matters more than it sounds like it should. A traditional compost pile works by exposing organic material to air, turning it regularly to keep oxygen flowing, and waiting 6 months to a year for the whole pile to break down into something usable. For a gardener with a strong back and plenty of free weekends, that system works fine. For a gardener who has spent decades in the garden and whose knees and shoulders have earned the right to be a little more particular about how the work gets done, a pile that needs turning every 2 weeks with a pitchfork is not a small inconvenience. It is often the reason composting gets abandoned entirely after the first season. The buried bucket solves that problem completely, not by making composting easier in some vague sense, but by changing the physical mechanics of the entire process. The bucket sits below the soil line. The worms and microbes that do the actual work live inside it permanently, fed every evening through the lid. Nothing needs to be turned, nothing needs to be hauled anywhere, because the finished material is already exactly where the plants need it, releasing nutrients straight into the root zone surrounding the bucket. The only physical effort required, once the bucket is buried, is the 10 seconds it takes to lift a lid and drop in a handful of scraps. Here is the complete materials list and the exact specifications, because getting these details right is what separates a system that works for years from one that fails within weeks. 1 5-gallon food-grade plastic bucket. These are often available free from bakeries, delis, and restaurants, which routinely discard the buckets that frosting, pickles, and other bulk ingredients arrive in. A quick phone call to a local bakery is usually all it takes. The bucket needs a tight-fitting lid, which most food-grade buckets already include. 1 drill with a 1/2-inch drill bit. This specification is not flexible, and it is the first mistake worth addressing directly. A 1/4-inch hole is too small. Worms cannot easily pass through a hole that size, and the developing root systems of nearby plants have no meaningful way to enter and access the nutrients inside. 1/2 inch is the minimum. 5/8 of an inch or larger works even better, particularly along the lower third of the bucket where root access matters most. Drill holes around the entire circumference of the bucket, spaced roughly 3 to 4 inches apart, in horizontal rows from the bottom to about 2/3 of the way up the sides. Drill an additional cluster of holes directly into the bottom of the bucket as well. The goal is a structure that functions less like a sealed container and more like a porous chamber, open enough for worms and roots to move freely in and out, contained enough that the materials inside stay put and the lid keeps the surface area protected from rain and pests. Once the bucket is drilled, dig a hole in the center of the garden bed, or roughly centered between the plants intended to benefit from it. The hole needs to be deep enough that when the bucket is set into it, only the top 4 inches of the bucket, along with the lid, remain visible above the soil surface. This typically means digging 12 to 14 inches deep for a standard 5-gallon bucket. Set the bucket into the hole and backfill the surrounding soil firmly against the sides, packing it down enough that the bucket sits stable and does not shift when the lid is removed and replaced repeatedly over the coming months. That installation, start to finish, takes most gardeners under 15 minutes. The system is now ready to begin feeding. Each evening, kitchen scraps go directly into the bucket through the lid. Banana peels, used coffee grounds, and the paper filters they came in, crushed eggshells, wilted lettuce and other leafy greens, carrot tops, apple cores, melon rinds, and small amounts of bread. The lid goes back on immediately after each addition. Here is the second specification worth being exact about, because this is where a meaningful number of first attempts go wrong. Citrus peels, onion and garlic scraps, and anything containing meat, dairy, or oil should not go into this particular system in significant quantities. Citrus and onion family scraps are mildly inhospitable to the red worms that will be doing the bulk of the work inside the bucket. And meat, dairy, and oil introduce smell and pest problems that the rest of this system is specifically designed to avoid. A small amount of citrus or onion occasionally will not break the system, but treating it as a primary input will slow worm activity and reduce the overall effectiveness of the bucket. Now, the part that determines whether this system works at all: the worms. This is the single most common point of failure for anyone attempting this for the first time, and it deserves to be addressed plainly. The worms sold at most bait shops, the large, thick nightcrawlers most people picture when they hear the word earthworm, are the wrong species for this application. Nightcrawlers are deep burrowers. In their natural environment, they live in permanent vertical tunnels that can extend several feet down into undisturbed soil, surfacing at night to feed on fallen leaves and returning to depth during the day. Placed into a shallow, food-dense environment, like a buried bucket, nightcrawlers become stressed, overheat, and frequently die within the first week. The species needed here is Eisenia fetida, almost universally sold under the name red wiggler. Red wigglers are surface-dwelling worms that, in their natural environment, live in decomposing leaf litter, aged manure piles, and other rich organic surface material, which is essentially an exact description of the environment inside a working, buried bucket. Red wigglers are available from worm farms and online retailers, typically sold by the pound, with a pound containing somewhere between 800 and 1,000 individual worms. A single pound is sufficient to establish a bucket of this size. Add the worms to the bucket along with the first round of kitchen scraps and a handful of slightly damp shredded newspaper or cardboard, which gives them initial bedding material and helps regulate moisture while the system establishes itself. Within the first 1 to 2 weeks, the worm population inside the bucket will be adjusting to its new environment. Feeding can continue daily during this period, though it helps to add scraps in smaller amounts until clear signs of active worm movement are visible near the surface of the material. Once the colony is established, which typically takes 2 to 3 weeks, scraps added one evening are frequently noticeably reduced or fully processed by the following evening, a clear sign the system has reached working capacity. A single pound of red wigglers, under good conditions, can process roughly half their own body weight in food waste per day, and their population doubles roughly every 90 days under stable conditions. meaning the system's processing capacity increases on its own over time without any additional input beyond continued feeding. There is an alternative version of this system worth mentioning for anyone who prefers a more visually refined option over straightforward function. An unblazed terracotta pot buried in the same manner with the drainage hole at the bottom left open and additional holes optionally added around the sides performs a similar function through a different mechanism. Terracotta is naturally porous, and rather than relying primarily on drilled holes for material exchange, it allows liquid nutrients, often called leachate, to seep slowly and continuously through the clay walls into the surrounding soil. 2 terracotta pots, one set into the ground and a second inverted on top to function as a lid, create a simple and durable version of this system that some gardeners report lasting in the ground for a decade or more, with only occasional emptying of accumulated solid material. The trade-off is primarily aesthetic and material cost. A terracotta version typically costs more upfront than a $5 plastic bucket, but for a garden bed visible from a patio or kitchen window, many gardeners consider the visual difference worth the additional expense. Now, what is actually happening inside the bucket? Because understanding the mechanism helps explain why patience during the first month matters more than it might seem to. In the first few days after the system is established, bacteria move in first, breaking down the simplest and softest materials, the banana peels and soft vegetable scraps, releasing heat in the process. It is common for a newly established bucket to feel noticeably warm to the touch during this initial period, sometimes reaching internal temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit from microbial activity alone. This is normal and expected. As the easily broken down material is processed, fungi begin handling the tougher components, the coffee filters, the cardboard, the more fibrous plant material that bacteria alone struggle to fully decompose. Around the 3rd to 4th week, mycorrhizal fungi, a separate category from the decomposive fungi already at work, begin establishing thread-like connections called hyphae that extend out from the bucket into the surrounding soil and connect directly with the root systems of nearby plants. This connection allows the plant to draw nutrients from a much larger effective root zone than its visible root system alone would access, while the fungi receive a small amount of sugar from the plant in exchange. This is the mechanism behind much of the system's long-term benefit, and it is also the reason why disturbing the soil around an established bucket through tilling or heavy digging should be avoided once the system has been running for more than a month or two. Tilling severs these fungal networks, and they take weeks to re-establish. The fourth mistake worth naming directly, because it is common and entirely avoidable, is impatience in the first 30 days. A newly buried bucket, freshly stocked with worms and scraps, will not produce dramatic, visible results in the surrounding garden within the first 2 to 3 weeks. The microbial and fungal populations are still establishing. The worm colony is still adjusting and has not yet reached full processing capacity. Gardeners who check the surrounding soil after 1 week see no obvious change and conclude the system has failed are giving up at exactly the point where the underground work is just getting started. The visible changes: soil that crumbles dark and rich rather than dry and gray, plants that require less frequent watering, noticeably improved growth in everything within a 3-foot radius of the bucket, typically become apparent between the 60 and 90-day mark, and continue improving from there for as long as the system continues being fed. By the end of a single growing season, most gardeners running one of these systems report a complete shift in how their garden bed behaves. Watering frequency drops, often significantly, because the increased organic matter in the soil holds substantially more moisture than it did before. A single 5% increase in soil organic matter content can roughly quadruple the soil's capacity to retain water during dry periods, which translates directly into fewer trips outside with a heavy hose during the hottest weeks of summer. Plant growth within the bucket's effective radius, typically 3 to 4 feet, becomes visibly stronger and more consistent than growth further away in the same bed. A difference gardeners running multiple buckets across a larger garden often notice clearly when comparing zones. And the kitchen scraps that used to leave the house in a trash bag every week simply stop generating waste at all, redirected instead into a system that converts them into exactly what the surrounding plants need, on a timeline measured in days rather than months. One bucket, properly maintained, typically supports the plants within a 3 to 4 foot radius effectively. A larger garden bed benefits from multiple buckets spaced at roughly 6 to 8 foot intervals, each one independently feeding its own section of the bed. The system requires essentially no maintenance beyond the daily feeding once established, though checking every few months to ensure drainage holes remain clear and the worm population appears healthy and active is a reasonable practice. For anyone standing in a garden right now, looking at tired soil, a fertilizer budget that keeps climbing, and a compost pile in the corner that has been turned exactly twice since it was built, this is the alternative worth trying this week. 1 bucket, 1 drill, 1 half-inch bit, a pound of red wigglers, and 90 days of doing nothing more than lifting a lid each evening. If this kind of practical, no-nonsense gardening method is what brought you to Rooted Grace, the like button and the subscribe bell keep this work going every week. Drop a comment below with the size of your garden bed so I can help you figure out exactly how many buckets your space would actually need. And if there is a fellow gardener in your life who is still hauling a wheelbarrow of compost across the yard every few months, send this video their way. The next video in this series covers what to do with the system once it is fully established, including how to brew the material inside it into a liquid that can be sprayed directly onto struggling plants for an even faster response. That one is coming next week. Until then, save the scraps, drill the holes, and let the worms do the rest.